Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second 2022 seminar for the Australian National University Centre for Early Modern Studies. Our seminar today will be delivered by Professor Helen Hills, who is Professor Emerita of History of Art at the University of York. My name is Christina Clarke. I'm lecturer for Early Modern Art, Design and Material Culture at the Australian National University Centre for Art History and Art Theory, and I'm co-convener of the CEMS seminar series. I'd like to begin the seminar with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands the Australian National University operates and pay our respect to the elders of the Ngambri, Ngunnawal and Ngunnawal people, past, present and emergent. I would like to extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people joining us today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Helen Hills today for her talk, Desiring Silver, Saving Souls, Travelling Light and the Other Side of the Coin. Helen joins us from York today, and we have audience members joining us from different time zones around the world. So I would like to extend a welcome to you all and thank you for joining us at the ANU Centre for Early Modern Studies. For members of the audience who are not familiar with us, the Centre brings together a vibrant multidisciplinary group of humanities scholars and graduate researchers who study the long early modern period. Our research and teaching areas include art, history and design, literary and bibliographical studies, theatre and performance history, languages and historical linguistics, and the digital humanities. We will have the opportunity to have a discussion with Helen afterwards. If members of the audience have any questions that they would like to ask Helen, please feel free to write these in the chat or in the Q&A at any stage. Or if you would like to ask yourself at the end, you can raise your virtual hand on Zoom and we can unmute you. Now allow me to introduce Helen. Professor Helen Hills is Professor Emerita of History of Art at the University of York, and I can hardly do justice to her remarkable career in this introduction. She's published extensively across a range of topics, including Baroque art, architectural history, and gender and sexuality. Her monographs include Invisible City, the Architecture of Devotion in 17th Century Neapolitan Convents, published by Oxford University Press in 2004, and The Matter of Miracles, Neapolitan Baroque Architecture and Sanctity, published by Manchester University Press in 2016. Helen is currently preparing a book on silver for MIT Press. Helen has been studying and publishing on the role of silver in Spanish colonialism for several years. She undertook a project, Silver and Salvation, the Transformationality of Silver, 1500 to 1750, as Robert Lehman Visiting Professor at the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in 2017 to 18, and was awarded a Leverhulme Research Fellowship in 2018 to 19 for her project Silver, Surface and Substance. Helen also received 2 awards from the British Academy towards this study in 2021 and 2022. Today, we're honoured to have Helen with us to discuss her research on the seemingly paradoxical associations of silver in early modern Spain, a symbol of both brutal conquest and political, social and spiritual immaculacy. Please join me in welcoming Helen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christina, for a very warm welcome, and thank you to Rosalind Smith and other members of the Centre there at the Australian National University. I'm really pleased to be here. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm now about to share my screen. Something's not allowing me to do it. Wait a minute, sorry.
That's fine.
It's very strange, isn't it? We just did it. Hang on.
We can see that, Helen. Thank you.
Good. Always very nerve-wracking, these Zoom sessions. Okay, so I want to just draw your attention here to this middle quotation from Walter Benjamin, because in a way, his work has always informed my work in thinking about materials, materiality, and the soul both individually and in a sort of historical sense. So he writes, "For without exception, the cultural treasures he surveys have an origin which he cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great minds and talents of those who created them, but also to the anonymous toil of their contemporaries. And just as such a document is not free of barbarisms, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from owner to owner." And of course, that also includes us as academics and intellectuals. Silver is a strange and paradoxical material, endowed with peculiarly transformative capacities in the early modern world. Brutally extracted from the earth in the so-called New World, it fed Spain's imperial war machine, fired the engine of capitalism with coins, currency, and chance of profit, redefined commodity frontiers, and fueled global trade. But at the same time, in Europe, it was associated with purity and refinement of all kinds. The silver sword and the silver-tipped cane designated political prowess and distinction. Silver thread in a gown accelerated elite erotic attraction. Silver épergne and trembleurs, special new pots for new chocolate from the New World, shimmered with social sophistication. And pyx, chalice, and plate communicated the divine to humankind. Politically, socially, and spiritually, silver bestowed and conveyed polish, purity, and refinement. Its sheen promised elevation and was guarantor of success. Yet silver also marked the ruthless plunder of European colonialism, the genocidal degradation of native workers, and ecological ruination. Brutal conquest, remorseless exploitation, social, political, and religious refinement. Was one somehow necessary for the other, threaded through the dark machinations of European power? I want to consider this today through the lens of silver in Naples, capital of the Spanish Empire in Europe. This is part of a project to critically address two significant bifurcations in current scholarship. While scholarship on the historical extraction and working of silver in the New World is anthropologically informed, politically attuned, and attentive to historical and ecological issues, when it comes to silver artifacts in Europe, scholarship and gallery displays are still overwhelmingly connoisseurial, dryly technical, narrowly specialist, and aridly drained of political engagement. Something horrible is insistently held at bay. Museums and galleries go instead for a dazzle of treasure and enchantment. For example, the Diva Museum in Antwerp, which has a superb early modern silver collection, doesn't mention Spain or the New World. When I asked about this, I was told, but it's a museum for tourists. The V&A has a little diagram in an obscure corner of its silver galleries to show how silver was extracted from Latin American mines, as if a technical issue, devoid of political or moral questions, an apparently willful refusal to be disenchanted. In a parallel and related bifurcation, while scholars have engaged energetically with the politics of Spanish colonialism in Andean silver production, they've all but ignored the politics of Spanish colonialism in Europe, including in the Italian peninsula, whose way was paved in silver. Both those bifurcations are not the result of mere oversight. Issues that are materially and politically conjoined have been kept apart by European scholarship, which has been driven by a point of view over-identified with European elites. And this has led to a reluctance to acknowledge the degree to which high culture is deeply admired in these matters. Hence, while scholars have been alert to silver's economic role in Spain's rule, they've been slow to recognize its cultural role as an intrinsic part of imperialism, especially within Europe. Silver objects have received little scholarly attention, most often corralled into the inferior category of the decorative arts. And even scholars who have engaged with silver Baroque artifacts have treated them on the whole as objects for the display of virtuoso silversmithing and symbols of their owner's wealth. There's a citations from Jennifer Montague's book. In other words, strangely drained of the qualities that their very materiality brings to bear. What interests me is silver's material enmeshment in power systems of church, court, and colonialism, beyond the display of something supposedly already given or economic value. That is the cultural effects of silver's materiality. Spanish rule in the so-called New World and Spanish rule in Europe, specifically the Kingdom of Naples, were joined and enabled by the flow of silver. Vast quantities of silver and gold from the New World supported Spanish imperialism within Europe. Spanish viceregal rule stretched across the Atlantic to Europe beyond the Iberian Peninsula to include the Kingdom of Naples. Indeed, the Jesuits referred to southern Italy as the Indias de por acá, or the Indies over here, clumping together colonized native peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. Naples was the seat of the principal viceregal court of the entire Spanish Empire. Didi Ibarra's city here is a mesmerically enchanting city, bathed in celestial light. Its urban topography is punctuated with churches, monasteries, and noble palaces. Its port bristles with galleons, merchantmen, trading ships of all kinds, galleys, and tiny rowing boats. Heaven, trade, the church, aristocracy, all is in glowing order and shiny harmony. Here in Naples, the Quartieri Spagnoli, where thousands of Spanish soldiers were permanently stationed in the heart of the city of Naples, stand in for the Spanish land grab and military domination of the city and kingdom, paid for in silver. If the crucial role of silver in conjoining these two forms of colonialism is recognized, it becomes impossible to sustain the dichotomies of current scholarship. Something strange takes place in the discursive production of silver as it traverses the Atlantic. Silver shifts epistemologically from raw material recognized as enmeshed in exploitation and colonialism to refined, elegant object produced as if by magic, often by anonymous silversmiths. This prompts the question, in what ways might the conventional interpretation of silver in Europe have to be overturned for its politics to be exposed? Are the conventional taxonomies ways to avoid engagement with material trauma? I'd like to suggest that early modern silver's role is analogous to the horrors of extraction of iridium oxide by some of the world's poorest people at huge cost and to their local environments and their health, while at huge profits to powerful global corporations. And our soft screen fetish, with its allure of connectivity, achievement, recognition, a sort of yielding skin that we intimately caress. Either way, by thinking of silver in relation to coloniality, its peculiar capacities to interfuse discourses of exploitation and redemption, refinement and salvation come into focus, which in turn helps us to see silver otherwise. If early modern silver is marked materially by trauma, how, if at all, did it efface its own traumatic history through discourses of holiness, brightness, and refinement? Thus, is there a material affect, a materiality of trauma, or its effacement? We need to consider European elegance, for example, objects made in colonial Naples, in relation to the atrocities of empire, not in order to expose one literally represented in the other, but to discern traces, draw connections, and see one in light of the other. The conquests of societies and cultures of what today is called Latin America was part of a constitution of a new world order, a process in which the world's resources were violently seized and concentrated under the control and for the benefit of a tiny European minority. How might the lustrous surfaces of silver be seen as tarnished by the violences silver demanded, made possible, concealed, betrayed, and outshone? And did, in some dark way, European socio-political charisma actually depend on those very violences and their obnubilation? Spanish rule was dealt in silver. Silver was mined in far greater quantities than gold, spread further, in particular to China and the Far East, and was far more widely used for a greater variety of commodities than gold. While gold was king of metals and most prized, the vast bulk of treasure from Spanish Americas came to Europe in the form of silver. Indeed, the expression vale un Peru, it's worth a Peru, and vale un Potosí, it's worth a Potosí, reduced the entire Indies to silver and its value. Early modern silver was saturated in the politics of conquest. If the colonization of the New World was justified in terms of saving the Indians by converting them to Christianity, the riches of that world were claimed as the due reward to Spain's global monarchy for its defense of Christianity. In his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias of 1590, José de Acosta claimed the discovery of Potosí, the greatest treasure known to exist in the world, as destined by divine providence for the time when Emperor Charles V of glorious fame held the reins of empire and the realm of Spain and the seigneury of the Indies. He calculated that Potosí produced year after year 1 million pesos for the royal quint, and in 1585 alone, the fleet carried 111 million silver pesos, and that these sums allowed his readers to understand how great is the power that the divine majesty has graciously placed in the hands of the kings of Spain. Since it's been ordained by the Lord on high, we must humbly petition him to graciously favor the pious zeal of the Catholic king, granting him good fortune and victory over the enemies of his holy faith. For it's in this cause that he pours out the treasure of the Indies that God has given him, and still has need of much more. The discovery of silver in Spain's new lands was seen then by Spain's apologists as sign of divine justice, the rightful workings of providence and fortune. Hence, silver was a divine affirmation and justification of Spanish imperial worldly power. It breathed heaven's shiny approval. Silver was then taken as a sign of God's approval of Spanish colonialism, and more than that, it was closely associated with processes of purification and refinement. While gold was found in a pure state, silver had to be smelted, refined, assayed, purified, wrought. Initially, with the very pure silver from Potosí, only the Indians with their Juarez wind ovens were able to smelt it. But as the purest silver was depleted, more lead ended up in the silver after smelting. In the 1570s, the amalgamation process was introduced, a technique of extraction that pulverized ore with mercury to extract silver. And with it, the scale of silver extraction expanded hugely, and the indigenous skills were no longer central. Instead, indigenous labor was organized in the metallo systems on an industrial scale. And the environment was reorganized too, with the creation of massive reservoirs and dikes. The quantities of silver were gargantuan, It's been estimated that the Spanish monarchy minted over 4.55 million kilos of silver between 1600 and 1639 alone. The value of coins lay in their metal, not in the mint. Silver could be assayed for purity, while copper could not. Pesos, pieces of 8, bore the Spanish monarch and emblems of empire as far as the silver circulated. Silver was equivalent to exchange, the most mobile of currencies. Price was set in silver. Reproductive, metamorphic, the material of value itself, of coins and exchange, it was profit, the gain of flesh through the material that it imitates. It was the coin of deceit and betrayal. Silver forged an intimate connection between the divine and humanity. This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. It was silver that converted of transubstantiation in the Mass, silver that allowed the incorporation of the Lord. Likewise, silver assumed a particularly close, analogous relation with the holy matter of saints. Here we see a sort of smelting of San Gennaro, principal patron saint of Naples. Like silver, saints had to be assayed, their purity put to the test. And it's the reliquary that transforms saints' bones into a relic. And most reliquaries were made of silver. As relics, they become capable of linking dead bone to saint in glory, earth to heaven, capable of bestowing miracles and effecting conversions. Silver encapsulated the ability to shift one material into another, to cross continents and traverse cultures, to slip from one form to another, to exchange earth for heaven and back again. Silver caught the eye from afar and worked metonymically for the effulgent saints in glory in heaven. In Baroque Naples, wooden reliquaries were systematically replaced by silver versions. More silver reliquary statues were made in Naples than anywhere else in the world. From the early 17th century, Naples' protector saints were concentrated in the gleaming treasury chapel of San Gennaro in the cathedral. I've argued elsewhere that this chapel was at once a treasury, bank, and conversion chamber for Spanish silver, generator of local protector saints, here's a list of some of them, and as such, destined to secure Spanish domination, co-opt the local aristocracy, and deliver spiritual salvation to dutiful subjects. And it was silver that flowed in processions of amassed protector saints, binding churches, chapels, confraternities, convents, and monasteries to what is still too often assumed to be secular and separate from them: the city, the streets, aristocratic palaces, and the city seggi, the site of local aristocratic governance in Naples. Silver in Naples, then, works to weave heaven to city and to its salvation through movement. That movement holds open a possibility of spiritual transformation that celebrates not so much restoration and wholeness as fragmentation and multiplication of saintly bodies, an endless proliferation of potential and irresistible shininess, which is also the dream of capital and its nightmare obverse, the transformation of everything into mere transaction. Silver slides along, sundering and sealing its beneficiaries, its debtors, and those who pay its price. It radiates its brilliant allure. In its trail, it leaves mayhem, devastation, and despair. Yet silver slips through, passes this by, as innocent and pure as can be. The saints guarantee the silver, just as it guarantees them. Silver was that into which dross might be turned, but whose relation with matter depended on extraction, refinement, assaying, transportation across the known world, betrayal, and disguise. Just as the saints required their work to be done in silver, so it was silver, with its long and bloody trail of expropriation, exploitation, and destruction, that required the saints. Thus, silver even as it shone triumphant and redemptive in the faces of the saints, even as it proclaimed the vast wealth of the Spanish crown and Neapolitan religious institutions, dragged in its wake exploitation and destruction, human and ecological. Profit for some, silver already owed an unpayable debt, was the blood of others. Its brilliant allure, which charged up desire, was fed by loss and mourning. Malleable, soft, ready to be of service, the substance from which other objects had already been made, already passed on, refashioned, reformed, and melted into liquid. It was the preferred medium of valuation and exchange. Wrested from the earth by the blood of conquest and the savagery of colonial mining, refined Spanish silver was beaten by Neapolitan silversmiths into beneficence. Quartz glittered in what were known as noble metals. Unlike base metals, gold and silver didn't merge with lead during assaying. Saturn couldn't digest gold and silver, but vomited them up, purified, the noblest of his children. Pure but intolerable, disgorged from the earth's dark entrails, silver's shine belied its murky origins. The concentration of silver was in Naples wasn't coincidental. The city of Naples was the seat of Spanish viceregency, springboard and showcase for Spanish rule in Europe. It was its glittering epicenter and was particularly marked by silver, product of Spain's New World dominions and sign of divine approbation and the monarch's all-encompassing powers. More than 350 workshops were based in the Reliquary quarter of Naples, in each of which worked groups of family artisan groups. Entire generations of silversmiths, including the Maiorani, Porzio, Trelia, del Giudice, families of great prestige in the 17th century, produced vast quantities of silverwork for churches, convents, monasteries, aristocrats, rich merchants in Naples, its kingdom, and beyond. Silver's capacity to be melted down, you can see someone doing that here with these old bits on the floor, transformed and traded, means that very little survives of the innumerable silver objects manufactured in Naples. Changes in fashion, requisitioning for war, periodic seizures of silver, especially well known under Napoleon, filled the vats with marvelous Baroque objects to be melted down. They have to be reimagined now from lists in inventories and bills of payment. Magnificent silverworks were commissioned to adorn the Spanish court, the viceregency, and its entourage in Naples and Madrid. For instance, silver sculptures of the 4 continents made to models by Lorenzo Vaccaro were commissioned for King Charles II by Fernando de Benavides, Viceroy of Naples, and completed in 1695. Each of the female allegorical figures sits on a globe displaying a map of their respective continent, a celebration of world power and a material taxonomization of exploitation in the material that enabled it. And Viceroy Duke de los Arcos commissioned from Cornelio Spinola in 1647 a silver statue for the Virgin of the Carmine in Naples, in thanks for the death of the rebel Masaniello. Silver's mercurial transformational qualities were used in this case to transform bloody murder and political triumph into religious piety. In these ways, silver taken from Latin America, wrought by Neapolitan silversmiths in Spanish-occupied Naples, was made to celebrate the defeat of resistance to that Spanish occupation, to glorify Spain's colonial rule and shore up its collaborators, social, political, religious, or heavenly. Silver was made to support Spain's global imperial ambitions culturally, at least as much as economically. This is what Stephen Greenblatt has termed forms of mimetic capital par excellence. In Naples, the sumptuous silver collections of the Prince of Avellino, the Marquis of Campolatoro, and the Duke of Atrapalda were particularly renowned. Gold and silver were part of producing the refined and graceful sheen of aristocratic habitus. Silver furniture and courtly accoutrements, then, are not only products of social relations, but are themselves social relations. Silver is the Earth's most reflective metal. Its surface pools, flows, and glistens like water. Shining and glinting, the Madrilenan and Neapolitan courtiers were dazzled by their own reflections in silver mirrors on walls and sconces, and the erotic lability of the mirror, its capacity at once to desubstantialize and beglamour, its playing exchange of reflection, unveiling and revealing, are superbly explored in this celebratory mirror of about 1695 from Andrea Fantoni's workshop. Its frame consists of thick folds of fabric, as if it's dressed, just as fabric clung to the frames of those who gazed at its silvered glass to see themselves and their companions glitter back alluringly amidst the glow of candlelight. Marine creatures flourish flambeaux and support the mirror and its terrestrial register, above which improbably aerial spirits triumph. The mirror implies its own transformative capacity to bear aloft, to offer those reflected in its silvery surface an analogous transcendence. To look in such a mirror was to receive its glittering promise to be freed from mundanity and to be elevated into lighter, loftier, unencumbered realms. There are special qualities of metal and glass in candlelight, flickering, flashing, fleeting, and distorting. Hammering hardens soft, pure silver and creates shallow concavities that enhance the play of light over its surfaces, dimpled, twinkling, and lambent. Almost every conceivable object in grand households was worked, clad, or adorned in silver. Viceregal prohibitions on gold and silver on coaches and cabriolets indicate they were persistently so adorned. Fabulous design for beds and silver carriages, as if drawn from a fairy tale, survive in silver albums. Numerous archival documents record silver sculptures for dining rooms, desks, and bedrooms. Armories of silverware for banquets were ranged on credenzas, which are stepped sideboards, towering over guests, showing off the best pieces from household collections. Credenzas afforded the display of wealth, evidence of the family's credentials, as it were. The very word credenza implies trust and belief, an enmeshing of religious associations with the faith shown in hospitality. And this was materialized in the silver vessels they staged. Indeed, elite banquets were closely allied to the religious mass in ritual form and effect. Entire services of silver and elaborate individual table pieces were produced in dazzling quantities. Silver dishes were used for serving, bowls for drinking wine, and ewers and basins for washing hands before and during meals. Splendid silver salts and centerpieces were amongst the most important embellishments for banquets and ranged from the relatively modest to the runaway flamboyant. Thus, a silver salt made in 1656, which no longer survives, for the Duke of Lorenzano rose more than 35 palmi high. It displayed the four parts of the world at its base, figured by their principal rivers, then hours of the day with their meanings, while higher still, Time, as Saturn, in the act of destroying earthly things, was restrained by glory and immortality, indicating the temple of eternity, which crowned the whole glittering artifice. This pompous machine's capacity to produce meraviglia ai diletti ai convitati, as is recorded as a comment by Luca Giordano, the wonder and pleasure amongst the dinner guests, which brings to mind Greenblatt's observation that wonderment in the accounts of encounter and discovery was actually linked to the dream of possession. In contradistinction to marble, Metals engage in a material transformation that is not figurative or representational, but takes place in terms of viscosity, from solid to liquid to something else entirely. Metals aren't carved into shape or baked hard, but assume their form while in a liquid state, and it's that working that makes them purer. Hence, in part, the frequent figuration in silver table pieces of water and rivers, transformed as the sculpture ascends into fish, shell, animal, bird, aerial creatures of heaven, and almost the same thing, Spanish monarchs. Silver's material lability was adept at conveying the apparently intertwined whole natural world, heaven and Spanish power, one register shape-shifting seamlessly into the next. Points of contact tended to be animated, handles eroticized. This large ewer ended up at Amalfi Cathedral treasury. The website insists that it was made for secular use and only later given to the cathedral, and you can see why. The double volute handle is a naked woman, arched back, offering herself to be handled every time the jug is used. She flaunts her breasts on the cusp of the curve, handy for exploration by finger or thumb. Her genitals, while ostensibly absent, are substituted by a suggestive volute that at once covers, replaces, and amplifies them, its swirling movement inviting a delirium of agitation in the imagination. Meanwhile, the lower curve of the handle offers abstracted forms for knee, calf, and foot, permitting the eroticism of the upper part to spring free, unsullied by vulgar literalism. Something of the wonder and delight remarked by Luca Giordano may perhaps be traced in the series of silverwork designs made in 1642-3 by Neapolitan silversmith and ornamental painter Orazio Scopa. As scholar of silver, Corrado Catello has observed, not all the models by Scopa are actually reproducible in precious metal. Some are what Catello terms only bizarre caprices. But in fact, Scopa's designs are at their most interesting precisely when they're at their slipperiest. Consider this ewer. On the left perches a winged putu blowing a conch. His form echoes and inverts that of the giant spout jutting over him, as if liquid might be caught by sound. We are invited to imagine the liquid pouring as analogous to the sound emitted by the shell that evokes the sea, the sound of the sea. Water and air, fire and earth, liquid transformation. Disparities in scale, size, and figure render the whole shifting, alluring, like waves, like cascading liquid, the ewer's literal contents poured out in sound and movement. But something else is going on. The ewer sits heavily on the shoulders of two addorsed creatures, half putty, half plant. Their heads are bowed beneath the burden of the vessel, but their legs dissipate into bulging stems tucked beneath them, tendril-like, incapable of bearing weight, innocent of strain. A tension is set up, a hinting of something unnerving. Something heavy is shouldered, but its weight disarmingly dissolves as the eye travels. A new, uncanny nature is unleashed. Above the central body, relatively conventional with its frieze of bounding putti, handle, mouth, and spout are besieged by occupying figures that transmute before our eyes. It's as if the jug erupts, bubbling over with energy as the baffling creatures froth out from within. At the same time, the figures seem tormented, entangled, uncomfortably immersed in and merged with each other, disconcerting couplings that bind and unwind, struggling but unable to be free. Handle and spout are part of the same seething material from which humans, harpies, foliage, satyrs, and serpents emerge and back into which they sink, as if stuck in viscous liquid, as if trapped and frustrated in their own matter. From the apex, An old man's head peers down over a female body, whose breasts and abdomen thrust provocatively forward, only to dissolve into serpentine legs, the frond-like ends of which tuck under the armpit of a not quite epiphallic satyr. If the outer edges of the handle evokes a sort of Adam and Eve adventure, heads, bodies, and strapwork are more tightly conjoined in its cascading left side. The lower jaw here of an open-mouthed head doubles as cap of a bearded head, a figure whose shoulder emerges piston-like through the scroll of a volute. His arm grips the volute's side as if to steady himself. In turn, this is supported by addorsed female harpy figures here. Arms interlocked, heads weighed down, whose lower bodies, mermaid-like, dissolve in curling fronds, stifling any chance of escape from their burden. Living creatures are simultaneously trapped in and part of ornamental systems, creatures and plants locked in an impersonal machine. Burdens oppressed with no chance of liberation. This isn't merely the staging of the impossible, as in Escher's designs, but an investigation of invention through the contradictory negation of the thing from within itself. It's a tracing of desire and allure to find they turn back on themselves, repulsed, repulsively. Culturally, silver clad the court in a supercilious shine. Nobles wore silver and gold in silver and gold thread, lace, spangles, and embroidery. Gilt silver or silver metal was drawn into wire by specialist wire drawers. The wires were rolled to make strips. The wire strip, the lamella, was then wound round a core thread, usually of silk, to make silver gilt and silver wire. Extravagant and brilliant, precise technical skills invited you to stare, to take a second look, to admire what thrillingly met the eye. Silver rewarded looking, being tantalized, looking again, an erotic upper class, very pricey, bewitching, designed to ensure the lineage, the best catch. In his guidebook to Naples of 1692, Carlo Celano emphasized the city's unsurpassed gold thread, lace, and embroidery. He writes, "Here in Naples is made the most delicate lace of gold thread and of silk, which is inferior in no way to that of Venice or Flanders. Here are made the most bizarre embroideries of all sorts that perhaps have no equal in Italy." Celano emphasizes both the widespread manufacture and consumption of metallic lace and its marvelous capacities. There is no festival supplier, whom we call apparatore, who doesn't have at least 7 rooms of embroidery to hire out for church festivals, in addition to which, in a great many churches of nuns and regulars, they abound in quantity to adorn them entirely. There, silver and gold are worked most nobly. Silver transformed the day into a feast day. So-called most noble working turned human beings into walking marvels. Silver was a vital part of the alchemical process of court culture that transformed tawdry human bodies into glittering aristocrats, entitled to exploit others, make the rules, suit themselves. There is only one thing more enchanting than beauty, and that is the capacity to metamorphose into beauty, all done with silver, a shimmer, a flash here and a gleam there, sometimes dazzling, sometimes velvety, dark, like a metaphor for the nefarious plotting, internecine rivalries and deceitful chicanery amidst the glittering wit and brilliant smiles of court politics. The waists and necks and curvaceous handles of the large silver ewers and basins chime and rhyme with the arcs and curves and coils of silver dress, bodices, sleeves, hair at nape of neck, gold and silver thread embellished bodies fitted them out in startling carapaces, transformed soft flesh into ardent, shiny silver. Women in particular were kitted out in silver, woven, embroidered, belaced, made dazzling. Across the room, great vases were dressed like silver bodies or oozed bodies from their handles, lips, and spouts. Silver permitted these transformations, akin to the transformation of bread and wine into flesh and blood, but erotic, racy, chilling, unsettling. Like the miracle of the silver-guided mass, these lesser courtly miracles are made by silver. Take this cup. Do this in remembrance of me. Sight, sheen, surface, sex, seduction, guaranteed aristocratic pleasure, dominance, power, and lineage in the great mating game that saved their souls and guaranteed their name was melded, even as it was rendered apparently devout, sophisticated, arch, and witty, to the very substance of colonial power. It all came at a price, of course. Elegance and power and polish are ways to set groups apart. They give license to suppress, ignore, exploit what could be further from the unlettered, grubby miners of the Americas than the sultry, shiny, sophisticated Sylvia courtier. And silver tarnished. Spain's splendid dominion seemed unnervingly unstable. Credit was used to fund imperial military endeavor, and silver flowed out of Spain, causing bankruptcies and debts. In 1618, Luis Valle de la Cerda wrote that the Indies were the ruin of Spain's greatness. Lavish consumption was regarded as effeminizing. Political economists and moralists blamed the Indies and its wealth, luxury, and fallen values for the ruin of the Spanish economy and the effeminization of its aristocracy. In response to the financial crisis in Spain, precious metals in hats, shoes, clothes, and home furnishings were condemned. Individuals were not only squandering their money, but riches were feminizing citizens, undermining sexual mores, impoverishing the nation. The economic crisis was seen in terms of moral and sexual decadence and loss of patriarchal values, in which silver was a key thread. The return of the repressed. It was as if femininity and the Indies were corrupting, corroding, and undoing the courts, the aristocrats, the whole virile construction of coloniality from within. Walter Mignolo argues that the coloniality of power isn't just a question of the Americas for people living in the Americas, but is the darker side of modernity and the global reach of imperial capitalism. That darker side of modernity might be imagined less as the tarnish of silver than its shiny allure. A particular sort of capitalist enchantment, perhaps, that depends on a ruse and refuses to be undeceived or unenthralled. Silver's material qualities were activated in processes that were political and social as much as they were technical. Tarnish is endemic to silver, unlike gold. The shine of silver is endlessly threatened by its own staining that constantly surfaces and that can be kept at bay only by repeated polishing, work that banishes tarnish and renders its own labor invisible. This may be thought both literally and metaphorically. Silver's shine denoted invisible labor, a silent, obscured labor force who buffered and polished at dawn and night to keep nobility looking effortlessly lustrous and pure. Silver's role in securing and denoting many kinds of refinement may be thought of as part of an effacing of an originatory trauma. Something of this may be traced in the exquisite but chilling silver flowers produced in 17th century Naples. Here are made flowers of silver, so natural that they lack nothing but scent and color, writes Carlo Giuliano, suggesting that part of the pleasure of engaging with these exquisite lifelike creations was to imaginatively supply the precise qualities that they lacked. In light, however, of what we have seen tonight of silver, Gennaro Monte's flowers assume a less reassuring light. As much as to mimetic practice and what was supposedly imitated, their surface and substance can be seen to draw attention to silver, indeed to silver rising. They are better seen in terms of crafted surface than of symbolic depth. This isn't simply an assertion of the materiality of earthly things. The materiality of earthly things is presented not as given, but as unexpected, transformative, and transformational. The flowers do not simply convey a didactic message, but are part of a complex and collaborative process of making sense of things and of staging materiality as a slippery matter that is not what it seems, especially where silver is concerned. Into the relation of fragilitas and inevitability of death, the terrible materiality of things is inserted. This is not to see flowers as permanent, but to see the artificiality of flowers and the staging of silver, not simply making a virtuoso silver work visible, but shifting the terms of visibility through which nature and the salvific are imagined. Life isn't merely seen here from within the knowledge of its own finitude. The silver flowers do not resemble earthly life. They drain life from the flowers and instead stage the beauty of flowers without their colors, textures, scent, movement, and decay. They suggest instead a material dream of life after death in which decay, even of flowers, is banished. Not a hair on thy head will perish. But with the dream, in the transaction of transformation, as it were, the floweriness of flowers is lost forever. Thus, rather than seeking to understand the silver flowers as imitating flowers, it would be better to see them as imitating silver, or perhaps of bearing the disturbing echo from the minds of something now lost that silver both kept alive and extinguished. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was wonderful, and I hope the audience will join me in thanking you for your wonderful presentation. And I'd now like to ask the audience, or invite the audience to ask Helen some questions. You can, I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, you can write questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A, or if you would like to ask yourself, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. So I just had all of the channels open and then they disappeared. So I'm just opening them up again. Okay. I might just give the audience a moment to gather their thoughts. I have so many things I'd love to ask you about, Helen, and I'll try to restrain myself. So I'm interested in, you mentioned that the scholarship on the historical extraction of silver in the Americas is anthropologically informed and politically attuned, while the scholarship on European silver is connoisseurial and lacks political engagement, that it over-identifies with the position of European elites. Forgive me if I'm oversimplifying your position. So art history as a discipline is really implicated in the denial of the continuing trauma of colonization. How do you think that we art historians can address these shortcomings and be more comprehensive in our approach to elite artifacts?
Yes, it's a really interesting question, Christina. And I suppose in a way that's one of the real challenges of doing art history, because there's so many pressures simply to celebrate in one way or another, celebrate artists, celebrate patrons, celebrate these amazing objects. That's the seductive trap, isn't it, of beauty. And the question of how that beauty arises, how that beauty is reinforced acknowledged, treasured, often slips off the table, I think, despite all the pointless discussions by so many art historians on beauty directly, as if we can get it directly. That strikes me totally naive. It's got to be understood always culturally, always historically, and always inflected. So elites don't remain elites because they're stupid. Elites hold on to power because they're incredibly sophisticated and cultured. And what we mean by cultured, what we mean by sophistication is precisely this imbrication of culture to service its own ends. So again, I think art historians have lagged behind here, sociologists, whom they often, regard with some condescension. People like Pierre Bourdieu, for example, who long ago argued that cultural capital was crucial in understanding how elites hold on to power. Art history is the place where that work should be being done. Art history has the capacity to be the engine house of turning things around in that way. But the vast majority of art historians are not interested in doing that remotely. So for various reasons, why do people enter art history? Well, either because, I think of my own interview at the Courtauld years and years ago, as a young, quite naive student, we were shown photographs of images to identify. And I made, a few desperate remarks from a point of extreme ignorance. And afterwards, I was speaking to other candidates, and one said in particular, well, I knew it was a Reynolds because it looked exactly like the one we've got at home. So art history has both elites within it and others who are not elite but would like to be elite. So people who've been attracted to art history as a way through, another way of acquiring cultural capital. So those people are also not likely to start shooting themselves in their own feet. So there are these paradoxes within art history, plus the very problematic, really, really difficult relationship with museums and galleries, which are, after all, investment banks, and collecting. One only has to think of art as the major focus of the super elite wealth now. So these insidious forces, both within and around art history, constantly work to undo, to marginalize, to disparage work that does seek to undo something of the superficial trappings of authority of art history. Right? So what tends to happen, I think, within art history is that there are a series of bad faith and superficial gestures in which what is mistakenly shown to be art historical knowledge, connoisseurial celebration, the good eye, all of this sort of stuff, the charismatic ideology, if you like, of art history, that is taught and reproduced to students as if that is what they should be taking away. And that has its own allure, of course. I mean, it's all very seductive. So for all these reasons, paradoxical and contradictory, structural, social and political and economic, art history is caught. We have to recognize all of those forces within art history before we can begin to do art history. It's interesting.
Thank you, Helen. It's fantastic to hear your opinion on that. We do now have a few questions from the audience. I'll begin with one from Claire Hansen. She says, thank you very much for this absolutely fascinating presentation. I was thinking about your comments about silver and its connotations of purity and, of course, its heavenly links. In Shakespeare, we see several descriptions of the moon as silver. I was wondering about the moon/silver link and the moon as a symbol of purity, chastity, and femininity. This made me wonder about gendered aspects of the representation and use of silver. That's a question.
Yes, it's a really interesting question. And it's one of those very tempting, very tempting coincidences. For example, in indigenous Andean culture, silver and the moon are very intimately connected. That's also the case in early modern Renaissance alchemical thinking. Silver, so this, there's this alluring, apparently transcultural link there that is very enticing. And in the book I'm editing at the moment, there's going to be an essay by Tim Ingold on silver and why it shines silver, why the world looks silver, why it shines silver in moonlight. These sorts of questions about color, coloration, the moon, its waxing and waning, and the presence of silver, as opposed to the gold associated with the sun and the masculine. I have to say, I find this all fascinating. I'm slightly nervous about treading in those waters myself, which I think is for two reasons. I'm always very nervous when things become sort of transcultural and ahistorical. And I'm much more concerned with trying to be as precise historically and culturally and object-based as is possible, while not just getting caught up with the individual object as if it's not mired in these broader systems. And that is partly also a result of my relative lack of knowledge of indigenous cultures. So I'm learning some indigenous languages at the moment, and all I can say is that these are cultures of enormous sophistication. And we tread there and risk looking again like fools. In fact, in Quechua, there's a very interesting example. There's a word for people who speak Quechua, and then there's a word for people, everyone else, the Europeans, basically. And that word is more or less fools. So I think it's also useful to remember that the colonialists went in there thinking they could understand it all and make sense of it and flourish. And we risk repeating those mistakes culturally and historically. So I have very mixed feelings about this. I see the allure, I see the attraction, but I'm not the person to do it. That would be someone else, I think.
Thank you, Helen. Fantastic. I have another question. An anonymous attendee asks, how much of the augmentation of women with silver do you think is part of the male dominance of female image? Do you think it is indicative of women being seen as chattels and their display part of, chattels, and their display part of the patriarch's display, in inverted commas, of wealth?
Yes, in part, but I think there's a risk in underestimating the complicity of women in all of this. And again, we have to think about social class and elites. So we can't just think of patriarchy as men against women. We have to think about social class and how the elites, and I'm here talking about elite culture, those are the people who are deciding what happens. So what happens to poor people in southern Italy is very similar to what happens in the so-called New World to the so-called Indians. There's not, so, and gender sure always plays, is played out in these social relations, but there isn't a homogeneous, uniform, stable sort of patriarchy that just imposes itself on women. It's obviously much more fluid, much more dynamic than that. Women too are part of that. Women too are ambitious. Women too exploit their glitter and shine. They too want to get married and have children. They too want, So it's these are routes to power and authority, to privilege, to nice wines and good food for women as well as for men. It's there is an imbalance. But I think if we underestimate the complicity of women, we also are sidestepping the questions of social class and how social class works. too. And also how people can actually engage culturally in performative practices that are not in their own interests. It's a Marxist fundamental insight, isn't it? But again, think back to what I was just saying about art historians from lower social classes who think that by performing a certain sort of art history, they'll somehow assume some of the glamour and shine of it. They're not, they're just pawns, actually. They didn't, they're just part of it. So I think, again, it's about complexity and specificity.
Oh, thank you. Just one more question. I'm not sure who's asking, but you suggested challenging the taxonomy applied to silver as a way of getting at the hidden story of trauma and exploitation. Can you give an example?
Yeah, well, I think in a way that's what my paper was trying to do. My paper was trying to sort of approach some of these objects and look at them again and try to hold them in tension with that story of brutality and exploitation without reducing them to that. So it's not a matter of, one standard move would be to say, okay, well, let's look at images of mines. Let's try and understand the ways that Indigenous people were represented, Indigenous miners were shown. That would be one way of doing it. But I'm more interested in trying to take these high-end objects and to think about how they are part of these processes of exploitation, domination, trade, exchange, betrayal, and how something of those processes that Walter Benjamin refers to in that quotation that I started with, leave traces. That's the interesting thing about history. So however brilliant the elites may be, the traces of their exploitation, their double standards, their cruelty, those remain. There are always traces to be found. So that's a matter of sort of reading against the grain. I'd also say about trauma, I'm really interested in the question of trauma, and which is Greek for wound, and is taken up by psychoanalysis, Freud in particular, in relation to the psychoanalytic. And he sees it in terms of something that cannot be spoken about directly. People like Cathy Carruth, Dominic Lecapre have done very fascinating work on this question of the ellipses and aporia, the unspeakability that trauma in some ways might be seen to open up. So again, there seems to me something very interesting about this Benjaminian move of seeing the whole in the small, not in literal terms and not in direct terms, but in terms of Nachträglichkeit. So again, it requires the knight's move, the work of the imagination. You're not going to find it in a document. And that's why I think there is a sort of poetics of art history that has to come in.
I just seen that Roz has a question, Director of Centre for Early Modern Studies.
Oh, I do have a question. I can't put it in the Q&A for some reason because I'm a panellist. That's why I'm asking it. Wonderful paper, so interesting. But I was very, very struck by the kind of ephemeral nature of these objects, that they can be melted down and changed into something else. And I was wondering how kind of aware people were of that, or whether that was part of the kind of discourse around these objects, that they were at the time, that they were considered as such, that they could transform into something else quite easily. And I mean, you made much of that kind of metaphor of transformation all through your paper, which was fantastic. And, you know, I've got a related question, which is around the impermanence that silver, you know, could transform people in terms of class, in terms of rank, in terms of beauty. And again, was that seen as reversible, or to be able to be transformed at a second stage?
Yes, that transformationality of silver is always there. And it's spoken of directly in relation to investment in silver. So silver objects are always recorded by weight. There may be in inventories and so on some description of what they look like, but very often not much more than weight, because in the end that is what silver was. It was an investment for the future that could be redeemed or made more fashionable, brought up to date, or whatever it may be. And over again, in private collections, church collections, state collections, huge quantities. Think of Christina's work on Louis XIV silver. These gigantic furnitures are hauled in and reduced when wars happen in particular. So yes, there's no question about it that silver was always seen as being on its way to something else, being this mobility, this capacity for being a currency, no matter what form it occupies, I think is key. And it's articulated more or less, directly in almost all discussions of silver. Certainly, it's implicit in those records. So, and the second part of your question was, well,
it was kind of, that it could be transformative for people in terms of class and rank and beauty, but also because it has that inherent malleability or ability to become something else, it's also reversible, or it's fleeting. And it's kind of, was it viewed as such, or was it just sort of celebrated in the moment, I suppose?
I think it was always seen as very precarious, and especially in early modern Spain, in which, there was this extraordinary paradox on which commentators, dramatists, poets are endlessly commenting. Here is all this silver coming. Why are we not rich? Mm-hmm. And the silver was seen as part of that undermining of masculinity, of monarchy, of gender roles. This sort of the liability of silver was seen as a liability. It really always that both sides of the coin, I think, are present, and the commentating on it at the time is very sophisticated, even if very anxious, fraught with anxiety. All these discourses actually are fraught with anxiety, from colonialism, the right to, turn the so-called Indians into basically slave workers, the right to extract metals and the effects of those metals. These are all freighted. The discussions of them are sophisticated, especially actually in the 16th century, very sophisticated discussions, theological discussions, which again we slightly lose sight of, I think. But yes, it has the capacity. If something has the capacity to make you special, you've just got further to fall. I think that's
Thanks.
Thank you. We have another question from Fabrizio Ballavio. Thank you for the inspiring talk, Helen. Thinking about the question of elitism, I was wondering whether the economies of power revolving around silver were at play too in more quotidian objects and not those exclusively owned or used by the elite, and to what extent might or may objects of common use be an object of art history?
Lovely question, Fabrizio. Thank you very much. I'm sure you're right. Instinctively, I'm sure you're right. Objects, quotidian objects, are as resonant as sophisticated, so-called sophisticated objects. I suppose, I am, as you know, interested in elites because I'm interested in power and how it is affected culturally. So I am overwhelmingly interested in elite objects in this, and really in all my work. But I suppose one of the interesting questions about non-elite objects again, perhaps emerges in some of the work of scholars like Tim Ingold, with the emphasis on process. So the object less as a sort of finished object, but how we think about the emergent field of a making of, say, a basket, something that seems on the face of it very modest, but the more you look at a basket, the more complicated and sophisticated these objects become, or might be allowed to become. So it's not a very good answer to your very good question, but yes, for sure. And indeed, some scholars are doing it, but I would add a word of caution. I think that with the turn to so-called the material turn, a lot of scholars began to sort of study objects in, to my mind, a rather reductive sort of way. So suddenly people would start writing papers on pockets in dress, as if that was in itself, hugely fascinating. It seems to me it's not hugely fascinating until you've made it really interesting. So it's not just a matter of taking an object and finding out a lot about it. I think it has to be about relationality, about what the pocket allows, how the sexuality of money begins to sort of turn in the apron, as it were, whatever it might be. So again, this is about materiality rather than materials. So materials just seen as sort of the inert substance from which things are done. Materiality allows for that process, that question of process, of something to emerge in the making, in the factoring which continues in use. That's a form of factoring. To bring out resonances and potential as a relation. And again, that has to be thought, a relation between material and human maker, wearer, whatever it may be. But that has to be thought historically and specifically, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. We have another question. Kate Flaherty asks, how does silver connect with alchemy in early modern consciousness?
Oh, another really good question, and such a difficult one. Very profoundly, because alchemy is about trying to make noble metals out of dross. It's about this dream of, God being a sort of form of a creator, of saving something. So I think, again, it's got this redemptive urge. And the alchemists and the metallurgists are really one and the same in early modern Europe. They're often thought of as being very far apart, alchemists like witches or something, but that's not actually the case at all. There's knowledges of from the alchemy are brought in to the works of metallurgists and the miners very directly. So I think both in dream and also in their very practical, the alchemists were incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly practical, as well as ambitious. These things are very tightly connected. And alchemy, yeah, as I say, it's really about that capacity of the material to be something else, something higher, finer, more ethereal, always. That longing continues in all kinds of other cultural forms. Again, there's some, really very good, interesting scholarship on this. People like Spike Bucklow, Sergius Kudera, who've worked on these things directly, bringing out the complexity of alchemy and its sophistication.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Helen. And I have so many questions for you in relation to my own research on Louis XIV silver, but probably we've come to 20 past the hour, so I might draw an end to the questions now. But I hope that everyone will thank me, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your marvelous presentation. And also thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us today and for all of your wonderful questions. So I'm just going to wrap up now with some closing remarks. Everyone is most welcome to join us for our upcoming online seminars later in the year. You could sign up for the CEMS newsletter to keep abreast of the seminar series. Just have a look at the ANU CEMS website. Our next seminar will be on Tuesday, the 20th of September with Professor Catherine Ibbott from the University of Oxford, who will be speaking about her current work on the writing of water in early modern France and its territories. So thank you, everyone.